Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for joining me for another edition of Unbashful. This is episode 32, I believe, and we are going to kick-start this podcast with the first headliner being my review for Elvis. Now, if you haven't seen already, I did do an out-of-theater reaction for the film, so I'm pretty much going to echo a lot of the thoughts that I had. I'm going to discuss if my thoughts have changed since I've seen the film, since I've had a little bit more time to kind of digest it, and talk about the film in greater detail. Now, first things first, I love this film. This is one of my favorite movies of the year. I would say it's probably my second favorite movie of the year, just behind The Batman. To be quite frank, I don't know if there's going to be another film this year that's going to take the throne at number one and dethrone The Batman. The Batman, for me, was just such a special film. I love the character, obviously. He's my favorite superhero of all time, and I think that the direction and the interpretation that Matt Reeves brought was unlike anything we've ever seen with that character. But anyways, that's irrelevant. That has nothing to do with Elvis. Let's get back to Elvis. I'm a huge fan of biopics. I love Rocketman. I love Bohemian Rhapsody. I think they're incredible films. And once I heard that this film was coming, about probably three years ago, I heard that Austin Butler was going to be portraying Elvis. I'm not very familiar with his work. The only film that I've seen Austin Butler in is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He had a supporting role, a very important role in the story, I might add. But I enjoyed him. He played the Tex character. He's one of Charles Manson's disciples. He's one of the people that invade Cliff Booth's house at the end of the film, and basically that whole climax scene where everybody gets fucked up and the one girl gets burnt to a crisp. But I liked him in that film, and I've been curious to see what else we could see from him. And like I said, I'm very unfamiliar with his filmography, but I believe, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that this is his first lead role in a feature film. And I was on board as soon as I saw the trailer. I think he's got the dialect down, because Elvis very much has a very significant accent. Like, it's very recognizable. Like, you hear his voice, it's Elvis. Obviously, he moves a very certain way. I think Austin Butler certainly had the movement down, the dialect, and everything else. And he's discussed in interviews how he didn't want to make it seem like he was doing an impersonation of Elvis, which is inherently, that's the struggle as an actor. You don't, especially when you're portraying a real person, is you don't want to seem like you want to try your best at least, because in reality it is an impersonation. But you don't want it to seem like it's an impersonation. You want it to come across as authentic. You want it to come across as real as possible. And when I was watching this film, I always knew that I wasn't watching Elvis, but I was so pulled in, and I was so immersed in the story and in Austin Butler's performance that by the end of the film, they showed footage of actual, Elvis Presley. And I almost had to remind myself that, wow, like, that's the real Elvis. And I watched an interpretation of him. So getting back to my point of what I was saying in the beginning, Austin Butler really put the work in for this role. He discussed how he obsessed about it for 2 years. It was nothing but him doing his research, as I mentioned, getting the dialect down. I'm sure he probably had a dialect coach that he worked with, getting the movement down, everything. And he explained how the first tape he made to send to Baz Luhrmann, basically as an audition, he was pretty apprehensive about it, because he felt like it was just, he watched it and he felt, this is just an impersonation. This isn't Elvis. Now, whether that's true or not, I mean, we'll never know until we actually see that. And to be fair, he's probably his biggest critic. I think a lot of people can relate to that, especially if you're trying to do something in the arts, in the creative medium. right? Nobody will put you down harder than yourself. So that, some of that could have had something to do with it. But whatever his strategy was, it worked. Because he explained how in that process of getting the part, there never really was like one audition. Like he didn't go into a room and Baz Luhrmann and the casting director were like, okay, yeah, do this, yeah, okay, thank you, we'll call you. It was apparently a very long process of collaboration is what they've described it as if he already had the part. And then eventually it obviously led up to him getting the part. And what I find pretty interesting was I was doing some research, and along with Austin Butler, some of the other candidates, the front runners right behind him to play the character of Elvis was Miles Teller and Harry Styles. Now with Harry Styles, the thing is he is already such a star in and of himself. And Baz Luhrmann even discussed this as well. He's already, like, Harry Styles is already an icon. So I think as an audience member, unless he gave the performance of a lifetime, it would be very, very hard for the general audience to separate seeing Harry Styles and him and seeing Elvis. It'd be hard to make that kind of differentiation, right? Because you're seeing this guy who's already a singer in that art, and he's already a musician. It's hard to kind of differentiate that. But I do think, though, with Harry Styles, I actually think that he's a pretty underrated actor. When I first saw him in Dunkirk, a very short role, I think that was his feature film debut, and I really enjoyed him in Dunkirk for the little amount that we saw. And then he was in Eternals, which that shocked me, because I'm pretty, active on the internet, and I'm always keeping myself up to date with, the newest leaks and casting reports for a lot of the Marvel projects. And I never heard once about Harry Styles in the Eternals. So when that happened, that was very surprising. So I'm curious to see him in that. I'm very excited to see him in Olivia Wilde's next film, Don't Worry, Darling. He's going to be co-starring along with Florence Pugh. And a laundry list of fantastic actors and actresses in that film. Who's the one guy in there from Chris Pine? Yep, Chris Pine, Gemma Chan, incredible cast. Olivia Wilde is also starring in the film as well. So yeah, but as much as I am a fan of Harry Styles and his rise as an actor, I don't think that would have been the right choice for this role. That's just my opinion. Now with Miles Teller, however, that's pretty interesting because his career, he certainly had a resurgence. I think, while Fantastic Four was a flop and overall was a pretty bad film, let's just call it what it is, I didn't mind his portrayal as Reed Richards. And, call me crazy, but this won't happen, obviously, but I would not even mind to see him come back to play Reed. Because I'll be honest, I don't think John Krasinski is coming back as Reed Richards. Anyways, I'm getting sidetracked. I'm all over the place. Let's get back to my Elvis review. With Miles Teller, he certainly could have pulled off the look. I don't doubt he could have pulled off the dialect. He's a very talented actor. I'm sure he's got the work ethic. So I think it would have been pretty interesting. In another world, in another lifetime, I'd be curious to see Miles Teller play Elvis. I certainly think he could have done a pretty good job. And, going back to Harry Styles, even with the look, he certainly could have pulled off the look, like the visuals, the hair, everything like that. And he's pretty young as well. All three of those actors, Austin Butler, Miles Teller, Harry Styles, are all young enough to play the role. But like I said, I just don't think it would be pretty hard for audiences to separate Harry Styles from Elvis. But back to Austin Butler. He gave the best performance of his career so far. And like I said, I haven't seen really any of his films aside from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So for me saying that, take it as it is, I guess, because I'm pretty unfamiliar with his work. But that doesn't take away from how amazing his performance was as Elvis. I loved it. I loved every second of it. Now, the story isn't really played from his perspective. It's mostly, like, the story is mostly told, the narrative is mostly told through his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, which is Tom Hanks' character, who I'll get into in a minute. But right now, I would probably say that Austin Butler's performance is my pick for Best Actor. Now, I don't think he'll win it, because we still have half a year left, pretty much. Little over half a year left. And there's a lot of really good movies coming out for the rest of the year. So that remains to be seen. But this is around the time, though. Like, this is the perfect time to get his name in that kind of conversation. Because the thing about the Oscars is, if you release a film too early, it's likely not going to win any awards. Unless it's, not a home run. And if you release a film too late at the end of the year, that also hurts a film's chance from getting Oscar recognition. Now, it has been done before, don't get me wrong. Like, The Godfather is an example of that. That came out pretty late in that schedule, that calendar year for the Oscars. So it certainly is possible. But I think Elvis, it came out in June. So it's in that prime time to get that real kind of Oscar buzz. I mean, inherently, this film is very much an Oscar bait film. The Academy loves biopic films. Obviously, Bohemian Rhapsody won Best Picture, and I don't know if it won Best Picture, but I know that Rami Malek won Best Actor as Freddie Mercury, which he did a fantastic job. But where are we here? Yeah. So right now, Austin Butler is my pick to win Best Actor, and until I see otherwise, I'm sticking with him as my pick. And when I was discussing the schedule just now, films releasing too early or too late, that's why I've been saying that as much as I enjoyed Everything Everywhere All at Once, I don't think it's going to win Best Picture. It could get nominated. I wouldn't be surprised. But Best Picture, I'm not entirely sure. And it could win, I think if it's going to win any awards, I think it's most likely to win Best Original Screenplay. But as I mentioned, we still have half a year left. And there's lots of other great movies coming out, original films like Babylon, Amsterdam. So we'll have to wait. Now let's go to Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks played, as I mentioned earlier, Colonel Tom Parker, who was Elvis's manager, who very much took advantage of him. He took advantage of him, but he also objectively contributed to some of the success of Elvis's career. He gave him many opportunities that he probably wouldn't have been able to get otherwise, but he also took advantage of him. And they express in the film how Colonel Tom Parker, he ate up almost 50% of Elvis's revenue. Now, usually in the industry, obviously we're at a different time, but usually agents will take about 20% of whatever you make. Now, that's not 50%. That's a lot less. Now, 50%, half of the money he's made, that's fucking crazy. And we've seen before, there are a lot of evil people in Hollywood. Now, I don't know I don't know if I'm willing to call Colonel Tom Parker evil, but he certainly wasn't a good person, and I wouldn't want him representing me if I was in Elvis's shoes. But there's a lot of evil people in Hollywood that prey on naive, innocent people that are trying to make it in show business, whether you're trying to be a musician or you're trying to be an actor or whatever. If you're trying to be in entertainment. That's why people got to educate themselves and understand that not everybody is going to have your best interests in hand if they're trying to, be in business with you. So, and that sort of happened with Elvis, but at the same time, you do have to recognize that Colonel Tom Parker did put Elvis in a lot of different opportunities, like I said, that he probably wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. Now let's talk about the director, Baz Luhrmann. I've only seen one film he's directed, which I'll talk about in a moment, but I know he's directed films like Moulin Rouge, Romeo and Juliet. So, and those films have a lot of critical acclaim. So he's definitely a talented director, and he very much has a certain style. Now, what do I mean by style? There's one film he's directed called The Great Gatsby. Now, for a long time, I never knew that he directed that film. And once I saw the first trailers and all the marketing material for Elvis, it looked oddly familiar, right? And then I went back and I watched The Great Gatsby again. I've seen the film like 10 times. I could see a lot of parallels, and I could see a lot of similarities in terms of, the creative choices and the, the exaggerated colors and the very, frantic, fast-paced editing keeps you on the edge of your seat. And then I realized that, yes, in fact, The Great Gatsby is directed by Baz Luhrmann. And I was like, that makes so much sense. I could see so much of Baz in that film, The Great Gatsby, and I'm seeing a lot of that same kind of, like I said, artistic elements being translated into Elvis, which for me is not an issue. Now, I'm seeing a lot of the critics saying that that's primarily their issue with the film, is that the fast-paced editing, the sort of, some people describe the film being almost like a music video, which I think is a little bit, I don't agree with that, personally. I mean, there's music in the film. That's when you're telling a story about a musician, inherently there's going to be music in the film. I mean, if you went into an Elvis film not expecting to hear Elvis music, I don't know what film you think you were going to go watch, but that's besides the point. And once I found that out, like, as I mentioned, it all just kind of makes sense. And the thing about The Great Gatsby is that's one of my favorite films that I've ever seen. I love it. And when I was in high school, I never watched the film in class, but when I was in high school, many of my other films in some of their English classes, they would always tell me, like, yeah, we watched the film, and which is kind of funny because most of the time when you're in school and you watch a movie, you're usually just glad that you're not doing anything academic, right? And usually the movies that are being played in class are usually pretty shit, let's be honest. But I love The Great Gatsby. I don't even know where I was going with that, to be honest. And just to sort of give a little brief summary of The Great Gatsby, it's pretty much about a guy, Jay Gatsby. And, I'm going to speak very vague because, I don't want to spoil the film, even though it is pretty old at this point. I mean, 10 years old? I can't remember when it came out. It came out like 8 to 10 years ago. It's a love story. It's about a guy named Jay Gatsby who's trying to find his long lost lover. He was in the war, and because of that, he basically lost connection, and he hadn't seen his girl Daisy, and then she ended up moving on and living her own life and marrying another man, and then it's this whole story of him trying to basically inch his way back and reconnect with her, and by meeting her cousin, and it all comes together. I always do a pretty shitty job of explaining the plots of movies. Like, I find I'll go back and I'll watch my podcasts and I'll listen to the way I describe like a plot, like just kind of summarizing it. And I always think like, wow, I made that movie sound like shit. So definitely don't put me on the marketing team if you're trying to market a film, because I do a brutal job of explaining the plots of a lot of the movies that I talk about on the podcast. But besides the point, not to get sidetracked, go watch The Great Gatsby. I'm pretty sure it's on Netflix. It's a really, really good film. But as I mentioned, a lot of that style that I see in there, I very much see those same kind of elements in Elvis. But that's pretty much going to wrap up my review. I love the film, and I do want to see it again. Actually, before I wrap up, I want to touch upon a couple more things, more specifically some of the reviews. A lot of people are saying that the film kind of skims over some periods of his life. And I can understand that, but I think something people need to understand is that at the end of the day, it is a movie. It's a 2.5 hour movie, and you pretty much have to hit the bullet points if you're going to be telling someone's life story. You're not going to be able to tell every single detail at every single moment. That's usually done in like a series, right? Like take Winning Time, for example. It documents the whole process of how the Lakers, the Showtime Lakers came to be. If you told that story in a film, you would likely you'd likely have to sacrifice certain moments in that kind of development of that team. And certainly, yeah, if you look at the film and you know Elvis' story, sure, they do miss some things, but they document all the key parts of his career and his life. They show his early development when he was first starting out. They pretty much, in the film Elvis, they pretty much show the beginning of his career and the latter half of his career. They don't really show much of the middle. Like, they do, don't get me wrong, but the majority of the storytelling in this film is, as I mentioned, him when he's really young, like in the 50s, and then him in like the 70s. We don't really get much of the 60s. And for me, that's okay, because even if you look at Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocket Man, as great as those films are, they do skim over certain periods of their career and their trajectory, because they kind of have to. Otherwise, you'd have a 4-hour film on your hands. Now, I really enjoyed Elvis. I don't know if I could sit through a 4-hour cut, which is funny that I mentioned that, because Baz Luhrmann in an interview actually mentioned that he has a 4-hour cut, probably on some USB drive somewhere, but one does exist, and that's not surprising. There's always really long cuts of films. I mean, obviously we had the Snyder cut, which is 4 hours long. But yeah, so that's sort of my thoughts on a lot of the critics. Now, look, if you just didn't enjoy the film, you didn't enjoy the film, and that's totally fine. But I think for people talking about how they sort of didn't go over everything, I think it's hard to do that when you're telling a story within the confines of 2.5 hours. It's challenging. It can be done, but I think that sort of form of storytelling is much better off in a TV show or a limited series. But overall, I loved Elvis. It's my second favorite film of the year. If you've had the chance to see it, let me know what you think. Are you as high on it as I am, or you were kind of mixed, or did you not enjoy the film altogether? Let me know in the comments below. So for the next headliner, we're going to be discussing John Krasinski and the role of Reed Richards. Now, spoiler alert if you haven't seen Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, but I feel like most people at this point have seen it. We got John Krasinski as Reed Richards and the rest of the Illuminati, so that was great to see. Now, as soon as we got that, of course, us fans wanted to immediately know, is that just like a one-off? Is that just something to please the fans, a little bit of fan service, or are we going to see John Krasinski return as the 616 version, the main Reed Richards moving forward in the MCU, because we do know that a Fantastic Four reboot is well on the way. It's very much in pre-production. I'm sure I think they have a director for that film, and I think they're saving that announcement for Comic-Con. But the conversation has mostly revolved around Reed Richards. I haven't really heard people speculating on who's going to play the Thing, who's going to play the Human Torch and Invisible Woman. Most of the conversation has been around John Krasinski. Now, leading up to Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, most people knew that John Krasinski was going to be in the film. But even before that, there has been this demand for him to play that character for years. And I'm one of these people that I enjoy his short portrayal as the character, and I wouldn't be against him playing the character. I think he would do a great job. But I'm not of this camp that believes that he is the only actor on the face of the earth that can play Reed Richards. In fact, I think, and I have a list here that I'll name off in a sec, I think there's several actors out there that can do a great job, if not a better job, than John Krasinski can do. And it's not like John Krasinski is, on his knees praying to get this role. He's doing very fine in Hollywood. He's a critically acclaimed director with A Quiet Place. And of course, he's a fantastic actor. And I want to be clear, I don't want to sound like I'm not a fan of him playing Reed Richards. If they announce at Comic-Con in a couple weeks that he's Reed Richards and he's signed a 9-picture deal and he's going to be playing it for the next 20 years, I would be on board. I would think, great, I'm excited. So I don't want to sound or come across as a hater, of sorts. Absolutely not. But I just don't think that he's the only actor that can play the character and do the character justice, because that character has not had his due, you know? Like, he that character, not just the character, but the Fantastic Four, they've been due for their justice. And what do I mean by that? You know, I like we haven't really had a good interpretation of Fantastic Four. You know what I'm saying? Obviously, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Miles Teller, that Fantastic Four film was pretty bad. And I was never really a film of the early 2000 film, like of the early 2000s Fantastic Four films with Chris Evans as a Human Torch. So here are some actors that, besides John Krasinski, that I could certainly see playing Reed Richards. And these actors they're well known, but I wouldn't say they're like in that conversation of like that A+ list with DiCaprio, Brad Pitt, Joaquin Phoenix. They're not in that category, but they're certainly not like unknown. And, you know, one of these actors here, maybe two, one of these actors at least has certainly, I think he was nominated for an Oscar, but I could be wrong. But anyways, let's get into it. First things first, I got Jamie Dornan. Jamie Dornan, of course, was in the 50 Shades films, which I never saw. But I saw him in Belfast, and I really enjoyed that film. I'm a sucker for black and white films. And I thought his performance in that was great. And I think, I don't know if he got nominated for an Oscar, but I'm almost positive that the film itself was nominated for Best Picture. Moving on, Josh Hartnett, who's probably, out of the three actors I have on this list, I'd say he's probably the least known to general audiences. I know who Josh Hartnett is, and I'm very excited to see him. He was cast to play in Oppenheimer in a supporting role. I'm a fan of him. I think he's a good actor, and I think we're slowly starting to see his name come up more and more. I think he's starting to have a little bit of a resurgence in Hollywood. I think he's the right age. I think he's a good enough actor. And like I said, out of these three, I'll talk about the next actor in a sec. He's kind of a little bit more unknown compared to these three, and we know that Marvel has a track record of hiring actors that, you know, aren't necessarily mainstream and you know, don't have a long list of, you know, work experience, right? Look at Tom Holland, for example. He had been in films before playing Spider-Man. He did that one film as a kid with Ewan McGregor and Nicole Kidman called The Impossible. It's a film about the tsunami. I think that's based off a true story, and he was very, very young in that, and he's done some other things as well, but the general public wasn't entirely familiar on who Tom Holland was, and now look at Tom Holland. He's a star, right? We've seen him in many other films, like he did Cherry, he did Uncharted. Obviously, he's still doing Spider-Man. So I think that Josh Hartnett could be a name. Now, will that happen? Probably not. Will any of these three actors be cast as the role? Probably not. But this is just, I think it's fun to speculate on it. I think it's fun, you know, conversation to have on a podcast. Now, the final name is Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Once again, right age. He's got the look down, and arguably out of the three, I would probably say Jamie Dornan is probably the best actor out of the three, but you could certainly make a case that that Joseph Gordon-Levitt is the best actor that I just named out of these three. But all three of them are fantastic, and I think they would do a pretty good job playing Reed Richards. So let me know what you guys think. You know, there's other obvious actors you could point to play Reed Richards. You know, I've heard a lot of people say Cillian Murphy. Cillian Murphy's name has been kind of in the rumor mill for Marvel for several years now, and there's actually there's a lot of this talk, you know, around the trades that he could be playing Doctor Doom, which I think would be pretty interesting in like a solo Doctor Doom project. In fact, not to get sidetracked here, but I think I should actually talk about this. Howard Stern, believe it or not, yes, the radio guy, one of the best podcaster, radio, you know, people, whatever you want, one of the best people in that business. He was off air, but his mic was still on recently, and he was talking about, I got this Doctor Doom thing I'm doing soon. So whether that's legit or not, but he did actually say that. So like that's real. That's not even like a rumor. He did say that, and people, you know, have been discussing like, you know, how serious was he being? I mean, I don't think he would just bring up as like a joke, like, oh, I'm doing a Doctor Doom project. First of all, a Doctor Doom solo project, like that's such a specific thing. I don't think he was lying about that. And I also don't think that that was accidental at the same time. I think he very much knew that the mics were still on, and almost like a, you know, like a pretty creative way to market and kind of tease things that come from Marvel. And I'm sure we'll hear about things like that at San Diego Comic-Con. But getting back to the topic at hand, to sort of round up this headliner, I would like to see John Krasinski play Reed Richards, but I don't think he's the only person that has to or that can play the character. But let me know what you guys think. Are you one of the people that think, I only want to see John Krasinski play Reed Richards, and if anybody else plays him, I'm not watching the film? I think that's kind of a ridiculous approach to, you know, to watching a film. But if you share that love for John Krasinski and him potentially playing the character full time moving forward, then I respect it. And let me know in the comments below. So I talked on my last podcast how Kevin Feige recently did an interview, and he said, quote, or not quote, but I'm going to paraphrase. He basically said that us Marvel fans can expect some pretty big announcements coming in the coming months that will tease the direction of where the MCU is going. Because there's been a lot of questions and there's been a lot of complaints that the MCU has no direction, nothing's connected, Phase 4 is a mess, it's all full of one-offs and filler. I don't think that's bullshit. I think people are just jumping the gun way too quick. If you go back to Phase 1, that was pretty much what the MCU, like what the MCU was establishing in Phase 1, establishing new characters, introducing new IPs that people had never seen before, Captain America, Iron Man, laying the groundwork. Then they eventually built up to the Avengers. Then they built up to the whole Infinity Saga, and obviously the rest is history. I think we're sort of seeing that, not the exact same kind of formula, but we're seeing elements of that repeated, right? We're getting new characters, new IPs, they're introducing new stories. And even so, we're still seeing that things are connected. They talked about incursions, they talked about incursions in Multiverse of Madness, which that's a word that inherently has ties to Secret Wars. So I think the clues have already been presented to us. So, but Kevin Feige said that those announcements are coming in the coming months, and when he said that, I thought he was just referring to D23, which is Disney's big event that they do usually around the end of the year, around September, October. And they did it last year, and they announced a lot of different movies and a lot of different Disney Plus shows like Agatha Harkness, Ironheart, things of that nature. And I thought that's the event that he was referring to, because at that point, Marvel had no plans to attend Comic-Con this year. Shortly after that announcement, after I did that podcast, the reports came through that it's official that Marvel will in fact be at this year's Hall H San Diego Comic-Con. And that's incredibly significant, because the last Comic-Con panel that they did was back before the pandemic in 2019, the year Endgame came out. And that's that panel where they announced Phase 4 and all the other films, obviously the films that we've already seen, like Doctor Strange, Multiverse of Madness, the new Thor that's coming out, Spider-Man No Way Home. So that was the last time we saw Marvel host a panel at Comic-Con. So you have to think that if they're coming back, they're probably coming back with some pretty big announcements. So pretty much everything that I speculated on in regards to what they'll show at D23, you can pretty much expect those same kind of announcements to happen at San Diego Comic-Con. So now that we know that they have D23, which is going to be in September, and now they are going to be at Comic-Con, what will probably happen is that we'll get the big movie announcements. We're not going to get a Phase 5, slate yet. We still got quite a few films left to go in Phase 4, but I think we're still going to get some like things like Fantastic Four, Deadpool 3, and so on. Maybe even some X-Men stuff. I think we're going to get those movie announcements at this Comic-Con, and then I think we're going to get the Disney Plus announcements at D23. But let me know if you guys are looking forward to that. I'm pretty excited for that, and that's even closer than we think. I think that's this month. That's July. That's when we're getting Comic-Con. So I'm very much looking forward to that. There's been rumblings, as I mentioned earlier, about this, Doctor Doom project that's potentially in the works. Might even hear something about that. I imagine we'll probably hear about Captain America 4 with with who's the actor that plays him? Sam something. Or Anthony Mackie, but Anthony Mackie plays Sam Wilson in Falcon and Winter Soldier. But let me know if you guys are excited for this. Speculate down in the comments. Let me know what you think will be announced. You know, who knows? Maybe some Disney Plus shows will be announced along with some movies and stuff. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. So let's cap off the episode here. We're talking a little bit of some NBA free agency. I didn't think I was going to be discussing this because before all this chaos has started with KD's, trade requests and players opting out of their deals and signing elsewhere, some players opting into their deals like Kyrie, which was kind of a surprise. I thought it was going to be a pretty relatively tamed free agency. I knew there was guys like Zach LaVine potentially, who could potentially move elsewhere. But other than that, like I knew Brad Beal was going to resign, so like that didn't surprise me. But I thought it was going to be a pretty underwhelming free agency, and I probably wasn't even going to talk about it. But in lieu of all the craziness that's been happening, let's talk about it. So I came up with a list here of all the different trades and free agency signings and people opting out of their deals and so on. I'm going to go through each one and kind of share my thoughts. I didn't go through every single signing. I didn't put DeJounte Murray on my list here. I'm going to talk about kind of like the main ones that people are talking about. I touched on it briefly a couple seconds ago, but let's talk about Brad Beal. I'm not surprised that he signed, and really the only reason why I'm not surprised is the money. The cap continues to rise each year in the NBA. Everybody freaked out 2 years ago when Giannis signed the $200 million 5-year extension with the Bucks, and while that's obviously generational wealth, it's still amazing money. Now you have Bradley Beal, $251 million 5-year extension. Now, I mean, obviously I'm happy for anybody that gets their bag, but when you hear about an athlete making that much money, it kind of makes you feel a little bit depressed because you're like, what? I'm making nothing, like why should I get out of bed in the morning? I'm joking, obviously. But yeah, so he got the bag. Now, personally, would I have given him $251 million? If I'm the general manager of Washington, I probably wouldn't. I think he's a fantastic player, but what does he have to show for Washington thus far? Now, you could also play devil's advocate and say, what does the front office have to show Bradley Beal so far? Or what have they showed him so far in terms of supporting him with a good collection of talent around him? So, you could play devil's advocate and say that as well. But I mean, they're in the Eastern Conference. There's obviously the Eastern Conference isn't as weak as it used to be, and it never was weak. It's NBA players at the end of the day, but a lot of people would always say like it's a huge, difference between the West and the East. So the East certainly has gotten better, but I mean, I never expected them to be championship contenders through the years that we've seen Bradley Beal kind of be the lead star of the Wizards, but I feel like that ceiling, unless they get another star player like a Kevin Durant, like a James Harden, like a Joel Embiid, like a LeBron, that will never happen, of course. I don't know what they're going to really be able to do to support him with a good enough cast of players around him to actually kind of make an impact and possibly push for a championship in the Eastern Conference. I just don't see it. And furthermore, by Bradley Beal signing this extension for all that money, it's gonna make it even harder now for the front office to actually put enough talent around him, because talent isn't cheap, obviously. If you want good players, it's gonna cost you some money. So by Bradley Beal signing a $251 million extension, it's actually digging an even deeper hole for the franchise to get out of financially, because now you're really only going to be able to afford guys like, pretty much just role players at the end of the day, like a Kentavious Caldwell Pope, who actually plays for the Wizards. I'm that kind of player. Actually, I think they just traded KCP. You're really not going to have any flexibility for another star to coincide with Bradley Beal. But as for Bradley Beal himself signing the extension, that doesn't surprise me. I kind of figured he was going to do that because I knew he was eligible for the Supermax, so it only makes sense. I had a feeling he was going to sign that extension. That's a lot of fucking money. That is a lot of money. That man is set. I think he was already set for the rest of his life. I know he already was on a max deal with the Wizards. I think he signed that 3-year extension 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, because he opted out. Yeah, he signed that extension for 3 years 2 years ago with the player option on the third year. Then he opted out this offseason, and then he re-signed for the longer deal. So that means his new deal will not kick in till the following year. So not next year, but the year I believe so. I could be wrong about that. But yeah, overall, not really surprised about Bradley Beal re-signing. And I still can't believe that's a lot of fucking money. But there's one player on this list who many of you probably already know who signed for an even larger deal. We'll talk about him in a moment. Next, let's talk about the Kevin Durant trade request. Now, up until this trade request, KD has never requested a trade. He's played out every contract that he's had so far. And then, out of nowhere, he requested a trade. And this was right after Kyrie just opted back in for his final year of his contract to return to the Nets. So we know that he's coming back, unless, of course, he gets traded, which is probably really likely now that KD's requested a trade. Now, I'm curious if Kyrie knew this was coming when he was, considering opting in. Because as soon as he opted in, everybody was under the assumption that, he opted in, the Nets are going to run it back and, probably try and put some more talent, maybe change up the personnel around Kyrie and KD. So I'm curious to see if he knew that KD, in fact, wanted out. Do I blame KD for requesting the trade? No, I don't, because similar to the Wizards and Bradley Beal, I think we've seen that team. That team can't get any better. It's actually almost the opposite of the Wizards. They had James Harden. They've had Kyrie. They've had Kevin Durant. Yeah, I understand that, Kyrie hasn't played a lot of games due to injury and vaccination stuff, which I'm not going to talk about. But you've had the talent. There is no excuse why that team has not at least been to a finals. Like I still sometimes have to remind myself that they got swept in the first round. That's that still is crazy to think about. It's wild. So I think Kevin Durant has probably sat back and said, you know what? We ain't getting any better. Really. They're not going to get any better. And I'm sure probably the stuff with Kyrie has probably been pissing him off as well. So I think he just wants to be in an environment where I think the main priority is just basketball. And the two teams that he's requested to go to, apparently through Woj and stuff like that, is Phoenix and Miami. Now, obviously, the only way he's going to get to any team is through a trade. So if we look at both of those teams, I think that there is actually potential for a trade to happen. Now, apparently, the Nets are asking for the farm. And absolutely, KD's still in his prime. He's still a top 3 player in the N.B.A. We're probably going to see the biggest trade in history get pulled off. Let's just play some hypotheticals here. I think we'll start with Phoenix. If Phoenix is going to do a trade, first of all, Phoenix has to figure out what they're going to do with DeAndre Ayton because he's up for an extension. I believe they're going to extend him. But I think what will probably happen is because 100% the Nets are going to ask for DeAndre Ayton. I'm sure they'll probably even try and push for Devin Booker, even though he just signed an extension, which I'll talk about. That won't happen. I think Devin Booker is pretty much untouchable, and I would assume Chris Paul as well. I think the impact Chris Paul has had on that franchise, it's been a complete culture change, and they're a winning team now. Obviously, they haven't won a championship, but they've done a lot more winning prior to CP's arrival. So I think those two are obviously off the table, but I think you're going to have to include DeAndre Ayton you're going to have to include Mikal Bridges. You're going to probably have to include, what's their really good shooter? He's tall. I think he's one of their forwards. Cameron Johnson, I think is his name. You're going to have to include him. I'm not sure what their draft picks are looking like, but if they got any first round picks, you might as well kiss all of them goodbye. So that's kind of one scenario. Maybe I'm forgetting about some players that could add to that list, but off the top of my head, I think that's kind of, to me, what a deal would look like to get KD. Which, to be honest, that doesn't even kind of saying it out loud, that doesn't really sound... It sounds like there's some better deals out there. So the last thing I want to talk about here, and I know I was about to get into it, but my camera died, as I mentioned, it was about to. Contracts, N.B.A. contracts. Now, I just talked about free agency and players signing these deals and that deals, but the only thing about the N.B.A., because it's a fantastic league, it's a fantastic structure, business, whatever you want to call it. The thing that bothers me the most, though, I feel like out of all sports, now granted, I don't really watch, many other sports, but I kind of pay attention from afar, but NBA is obviously the main sport that I watch. The thing that bothers me the most about the NBA is contracts and players not fulfilling these deals. Like, for example, Bradley Beal. I just talked about him. He just signed for 5 years. Even Jokic, they just signed for 5 years, both of them. How much do you want to bet 2 years into that deal, they're going to request a trade? That's literally how the NBA has been these last 5 years. These guys signing crazy deals and they leave after like 2 years. Like, it's happening with KD. Now, KD's different. I can kind of understand that. But it really kind of pisses me off to see these guys signing these crazy fucking deals and they're only really playing 2 years of their deal with the respective team that they signed the contract with. It's like, I want to see guys just stick it out and play through their contracts and then leave. Like, certain circumstances obviously are warranted, but that's something that kind of bothers me. Like, pretty much all an NBA contract really says is that you will be playing in the NBA for this amount of years, for this amount of money per salary per year. It's really not exclusive to an NBA team. An NBA team will sign a player, but really the power is in the player's hands. And sure, that's a good thing. Player empowerment, of course, has created players to, create businesses and ventures outside of the NBA. We're seeing that with obviously LeBron, Draymond Green, Jimmy Butler's got his Big Face coffee brand. So player empowerment is a good thing, but when it exclusively pertains to the NBA, I'd like to see more and more players sign these deals and actually honor the contract rather than sign it almost like with 1 foot in, 1 foot out, knowing that they're going to be gone in a couple of years. They're basically just signing for the money and kind of, rain checking it throughout, the first 2 years of the deal. But that's kind of the last thing I wanted to go over. Let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with that? What do you think about this chaotic NBA free agency? As I mentioned, it just started. There's much more to come. But let me know in the comments below. That's going to wrap up episode 32 of Unbashful. I will be talking very soon about the Black Phone. I wanted to watch it and talk about it on this episode, but I just couldn't find the time. But this podcast is going to come out tonight, being July 1st, Canada Day. Happy Canada Day if any of you are in Canada. And I'm probably also going to see the movie tonight as well and throw in an out-of-theater reaction on YouTube. So quite a lot of content coming. Thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you on episode 33. Take care of yourselves. I wish you all good health, happiness, and everything in between. Have a great night.